She had always been someone who tried her best to keep things together. Life had never been perfect, but she'd made it work. For years, she lived a quiet, simple life with her son, moving from one job to the next, ensuring he never went without. She didn't mind the struggles. She had him, her world, and that was all that mattered. But when things between her and her partner started falling apart, she could sense the change. The arguments, the silence, and the constant tension in the house had become unbearable. She didn't know when it all started. Maybe it was the long hours they both worked. Maybe it was the weight of life's struggles pulling them further apart. Or maybe it was just that they grew into different people. But it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that her heart no longer found peace in their home. It became more of a place of conflict than comfort. One night, after a particularly heated argument, she found herself standing in the doorway, her son tucked into bed, unaware of the turmoil unfolding around him. She stared out the window, wondering if she was doing the right thing. The thought of leaving scared her. She never thought it would come to this. She had hoped for years that things would improve, that they'd find their way back to each other, but deep down she knew it wasn't going to happen. Her heart had already started breaking. She left without saying a word. Just packed a bag, grabbed her son's favorite toy, and quietly slipped out in the middle of the night. There were no goodbyes, no last words. She didn't want to make it harder for him. It wasn't that she didn't care, but leaving felt like the only way to save herself, and perhaps him too. She thought it would be temporary. She thought she could find a way to rebuild, find peace, but that was only the beginning. The first few weeks on her own were a blur. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion from moving around, trying to find a place to stay and figuring out how to make ends meet. It was the constant nagging fear that maybe she'd made a mistake. She had no family to turn to. She had cut off ties with her friends to avoid getting entangled in any more drama. It was just her and her son now, and it was up to her to keep them both afloat. They moved from one small apartment to another, constantly searching for something stable, but it was always temporary. She found work where she could, but it was never enough. She worked long shifts at a diner, barely making enough to cover the rent, and after paying the bills, there was little left for anything else. But she managed. For a while, things were okay. They found their rhythm. But as her son grew older, she saw the sadness in his eyes. The constant moving had taken its toll on him. He missed his father. He missed the life they used to have. He often asked why they didn't visit him anymore. Why didn't they have a real home? It hurt her more than she let on. She wanted to explain, to make him understand, but she knew he was too young to grasp the complicated truth. So she kept up the act, the brave face, the tough exterior. She couldn't show him how deeply she was struggling. She had to stay strong for him. As the years passed, the weight of her decision became heavier. The loneliness set in. She didn't make any close friends. She didn't have time for anything outside of work and caring for her son. There were days when she'd stare into the mirror and wonder if she was making the right choices. Was she doing enough? Was she hurting him by keeping him away from his father, from the life they once shared? She knew she had made the decision to leave, but she didn't know how to go back. There were no calls, no messages from him. She thought about reaching out, but the fear of confrontation, of facing everything she had walked away from, kept her from doing so. Over the years, she had convinced herself that it was better this way. It was easier to stay away and not deal with the past. But as time wore on, she began to realize how much she missed the life they once had, before everything fell apart. Then came the day when things took an unexpected turn. Her son had started getting sick. At first it was just the occasional fever, then a cough that wouldn't go away. She thought it was nothing serious, just another cold that would pass in a few days. But when his condition worsened, she couldn't ignore it anymore. His breathing was shallow. His face was pale, his eyes sunken. He was so weak, and he kept asking her, "Mom, am I going to be okay?" She didn't know what to say. She tried everything. The doctors were puzzled, unable to give her any answers. Each test they ran brought no clarity, just more confusion. It wasn't just the fear of losing him, it was the helplessness. She felt like she was losing her grip on everything. In those moments of desperation, she thought of him. She hadn't thought of him in years, not like this. The Tycoon, the man who had once been part of her life, the man who didn't even know he had a son. She had left, cut off all contact, and built a life away from everything they had shared. But now it seemed that the only hope for her son was in a place she never expected. The one person who could help was someone from her past, someone who by all rights had no reason to even care about her, let alone her son. She had no choice but to reach out to him. The message was simple, desperate, and direct. Only your blood can save him. The days that followed were some of the hardest she had ever faced. Her son's condition only grew worse, and with each passing day, she felt her heart breaking a little more. It wasn't just his frailty she feared. It was the helplessness that weighed heavily on her shoulders. She had always prided herself on being strong, on handling whatever life threw her way. But this was something different. She felt as though she was losing her grip on everything. He had been her world for so long. She had always done everything for him, from holding him in the middle of the night when he was sick to helping him with school projects and encouraging him to chase his dreams. But now it seemed like there was nothing she could do. Every night she would sit by his bed watching his chest rise and fall, hoping that he would make it through until morning. The doctors had no answers. Tests, scans, and medications had all failed. They kept saying it was something rare, something they couldn't identify. But all she knew was that her son was fading before her eyes. She started looking up other possible treatments online. She went from one specialist to the next, hoping someone would have the key, but it was all in vain. Each doctor was just as baffled as the last. None of the treatments seemed to make a difference, and with every passing day, her son's condition worsened. At night, when he was asleep, she would sit in the dark, her thoughts spinning. She tried to stay strong for him, tried to act as if everything was going to be okay, but inside she was falling apart. She had no one to talk to, no family nearby, no friends who understood what she was going through. It was just her and her son against the world, and it felt like she was losing that battle. There were days when she wanted to scream, to ask why this was happening to them. Why had she made all those sacrifices only to end up here, with her son's life hanging in the balance? But she didn't let herself give in to those thoughts. She couldn't, not with him depending on her. Then one evening, after another long day of waiting for news that never came, she found herself standing outside a small local clinic. It was late and the streets were quiet. The cool night air brushed against her face, but she didn't feel it. She was numb. The clinic had been the last hope. Another doctor, another round of tests. But she knew deep down that it wouldn't change anything. The look on the doctor's face earlier that day had told her all she needed to know. They were running out of options. She walked back to her apartment, her steps slow and heavy. Her son was asleep when she entered the room, his small body curled up under the blankets. She knelt beside his bed, brushing his hair back from his forehead. His face was pale, his lips dry. She felt a pang in her chest, a sharp ache that made it hard to breathe. The doctors had told her that there was one last option. It was risky, and even then they weren't sure if it would work. The procedure required a donor, and it had to be someone with a very specific blood type. The problem was that she didn't know if anyone close to them had that blood type. Her family was long gone, and she had no way of reaching anyone who might be able to help. She had exhausted every possibility, every avenue, but time was running out. Then, as she sat there staring at her son's fragile form, something she had pushed to the back of her mind resurfaced. It was the Tycoon, the man from her past, the one person who could help if only he would agree. She had never expected to need him, not after everything that had happened between them. But now, it seemed like the only choice. She stood up abruptly, a sense of clarity washing over her. She had to call him. There was no other option. If it was a choice between her son's life and pride, then pride had to go. Her son needed a chance, and the Tycoon's blood might be the only thing that could save him. The idea of reaching out to him terrified her. She had left without a word all those years ago, cutting off all ties. She had moved on, convinced that she didn't need him, that she didn't need anyone. But now, in her desperation, she was forced to confront the past she had buried so deeply. She took out her phone, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through the contacts. There was his number, familiar yet so distant. She hesitated for a moment, her heart racing in her chest. She had no idea how he would respond or if he would even remember her at all. The pain of what they had shared, the good and the bad, was still there, lingering in the back of her mind. But her son's life was at stake. That was all that mattered now. With a deep breath, she pressed call. The phone rang several times before the line picked up. "Hello?" His voice, deep and steady, came through the speaker. She closed her eyes for a moment, hearing the voice she hadn't heard in so long. "It's me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need your help. It's about our son." There was a long silence on the other end. She could almost hear the confusion, the surprise. He didn't respond at first, and she wondered if he was even going to say anything. But then finally he spoke. "Our son?" he repeated. You're telling me I have a son?" The words hit her like a blow. She hadn't expected him to react like this, but she couldn't blame him. He didn't know. She hadn't given him the chance to know. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know how to tell you, but I couldn't keep this from you anymore. He's sick, and the doctors say only your blood can save him." Another long pause. She could hear the sounds of movement on the other end of the line. She wasn't sure if he was processing what she had said or if he was still in shock. "I don't know what to say," he finally responded, his voice low, almost tentative. "How is this possible? Why didn't you tell me before?" She sighed, rubbing her temples as the weight of the conversation settled over her. "I didn't know how. I thought I could handle it on my own, but I can't. He's dying and I need you." The silence stretched on again, but this time it wasn't as tense. It was more thoughtful, like he was carefully considering everything. And then at last he spoke again. "I'll do whatever I can," he said, his voice steady now. "Tell me where to go." Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to agree so easily. She had prepared herself for rejection, for anger, or even for him to hang up. But instead he was willing to help. "I'll send you the details," she said, her voice filled with relief. "Thank you, I don't know what to say." "No need," he replied. "Just take care of him. I'll be there soon." As she ended the call, she collapsed onto the couch, her hands shaking. A wave of emotion washed over her, relief, fear, hope, all mixing together in a rush. She had made the call. She had reached out to the one person who could help. Now all she could do was wait. The waiting was the hardest part. Waiting for the procedure. Waiting for the Tycoon to arrive. Waiting for the moment that could change everything. But in her heart, she knew that no matter what happened next, she had taken the first step toward saving her son. And that gave her a glimmer of hope she hadn't felt in years. The next few days passed in a blur. Her mind raced with a mix of hope and anxiety, her thoughts constantly drifting to the call she had made to him. The Tycoon, the man from her past, the one person who could save her son's life. Despite the years of silence between them, she hadn't expected him to agree so quickly, but his words were clear. "I'll do whatever I can. Tell me where to go." As the days went on, she kept herself busy with what little she could. Her son was still so frail, and there were times when he would lie still for hours, too weak to do anything but sleep. It was heartbreaking to watch, and the dread of losing him gnawed at her every second. But she forced herself to stay calm, to stay strong, because that was all she could do. She had made the call. Now, she had to trust that everything would work out. She prepared for the arrival of the Tycoon, unsure of how this meeting would unfold. Would he be angry? Would he blame her for not telling him sooner? She had left without explanation, vanishing from his life without a word. The guilt had weighed heavily on her for years, but she had never known how to bridge that gap. She had thought it was better to keep her distance, but now, in this desperate moment, there was no other choice. She had to face him. The day the Tycoon was supposed to arrive, she couldn't sit still. Her heart raced as she checked her phone again. There were no new messages. She had sent him the address and the details of the procedure, but she wasn't sure when he would arrive or what to expect. It was like a storm was brewing, and she didn't know whether it would pass or if it would change everything. Around mid-afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she couldn't move. She wasn't ready. Not mentally, not emotionally. She was afraid of what was coming, afraid of the unknown. But she forced herself to stand, to walk to the door, and when she opened it, he was standing there. The Tycoon was just as she remembered him. Tall, composed, wearing a sharp suit that seemed out of place in the small, humble apartment. His eyes met hers, and for a moment neither of them spoke. It was as though time had stood still, and they were both caught in the gravity of their shared past. "Hi," he said quietly, his voice softer than she expected. "I didn't know what to expect, but I'm here." She nodded, not sure what to say. She hadn't imagined this moment in any way, and now that it was here, it felt surreal. The man she had once known, the man she had walked away from, was standing in front of her, about to play a role in saving the life of their son. "Thank you," she finally managed to say, her voice trembling. "I didn't know who else to turn to. I didn't want to bring you into this, but he needs you." He looked past her, glancing into the small apartment. "Where is he?" Her heart clenched. "He's in the bedroom," she said, stepping aside to let him in. The Tycoon followed her silently, his footsteps echoing in the quiet space. When they reached her son's room, the boy was lying in bed, his face pale, his chest rising and falling with difficulty. He looked so fragile, so small. She had never felt so helpless in her life. The Tycoon hesitated at the doorway as if unsure how to approach. It had been years, after all. She could see the tension in his posture, the uncertainty in his eyes. She had expected this. After all, he hadn't known about their son. He hadn't known about any of this. Her son stirred in the bed and looked up, his tired eyes blinking as he saw the stranger standing there. She could see the confusion on his face, and for a moment she felt like she was betraying him. How would he react to this man, this stranger who in a way was his father? "Who are you?" the boy asked, his voice weak but curious. The Tycoon looked at him, taking a deep breath. "I'm someone who is here to help," he said, his voice softer than she had expected. He didn't mention the blood relation right away, not wanting to overwhelm the boy. Instead, he approached slowly, sitting down at the edge of the bed. Her son looked up at him, still unsure, but there was something in the Tycoon's eyes, a sincerity, a kindness that made him feel a little less afraid. "You're not feeling well, huh?" the Tycoon asked gently, reaching out to brush the boy's hair from his forehead. "I'm here to help you get better. You're going to be okay." Her son nodded, though his energy was clearly running low. "Mom said you could help me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Are you really going to save me?" The Tycoon didn't answer right away. He looked at the boy for a long moment, taking in the sight of him, the fragile, sick child who was now tied to him by blood. He could see the desperation in the mother's eyes, the pain in her voice, and he knew he couldn't walk away. He had to do this, even if it meant facing the past that he had long buried. "Your mom and I, we have a lot to talk about," he said finally, his voice low and hesitant. "But right now, all that matters is you." Her heart tightened as she watched them. There was so much unspoken between the Tycoon and her, so much that needed to be addressed. But in this moment, none of that seemed important. Her son was sick, and he needed both of them. She stepped back, giving them space. She hadn't known how this moment would play out, but she could see that the Tycoon wasn't going to turn his back on her son. He was here, and he was willing to help. That was all that mattered. They spent the next few hours talking about the procedure. She explained what had to be done, how the Tycoon's blood type was a match, and how the doctors had given them little hope. The Tycoon listened carefully, asking questions when necessary, but mostly remaining silent as he absorbed the gravity of the situation. "Are you sure this will work?" he asked after a long pause. "I don't know," she admitted. "The doctors say it's the only chance he has. We're running out of time." He nodded, his expression serious. "Then we do it. Whatever it takes." That was all she needed to hear. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of hope. He had agreed to help. He was here, willing to do what was necessary to save their son. Later that evening, they arranged for the procedure. The Tycoon's blood was drawn, and the doctors prepared for the complicated process. But as she watched him leave the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that, in a strange way, everything was coming full circle. The man she had once walked away from was now here, doing what he could to help the child they had created together. She didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. Her son's fight wasn't over yet, and as long as they both fought for him, there was a chance. The following days were filled with a mixture of tension and hope. The Tycoon had stayed, and though there were moments when he seemed distant, he was always present when his son needed him most. They had agreed on the procedure, and now everything depended on whether it would work. The doctors had prepared everything as best as they could, but there was still that lingering uncertainty. Would it save the boy? Or would they be left with nothing but unanswered questions? She couldn't sit still. Her thoughts ran in circles, each one leading to the same place: fear. The boy had gone through so much already, and now this. The procedure was a long shot, but it was the only chance they had left. She had told herself that they had to try. They couldn't just give up, not when he was still fighting so hard. The Tycoon was just as nervous, though he hid it well. He had been quiet most of the time, his mind clearly occupied with the weight of what he was about to do. He had agreed to help, but he had no idea what it would truly mean for him or for them. All he knew was that somehow they were connected by blood. He had never expected to find himself in this situation, helping a son he had never known about, especially after all these years. Yet here he was. It was a strange, surreal moment, but there was no turning back now. She couldn't help but watch him as he walked through the apartment, always calm, always collected. But she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. He hadn't slept much since he arrived, and every time he looked at the boy there was a flicker of something deep in his gaze. A mixture of uncertainty, responsibility, and perhaps regret. But there was also something else, compassion. It wasn't easy, but he had made a choice, and now he was seeing it through no matter the outcome. The morning of the procedure arrived with a sense of finality. The doctors had confirmed everything was ready, and the Tycoon had undergone the necessary tests. All that was left was to wait. The boy was already prepped, lying on the bed, looking pale but alert. His eyes were tired, but there was a flicker of hope in them, something that hadn't been there before. She stood by his side, holding his hand, trying to reassure him. Her son was so brave, even in the face of something so terrifying. She could see the trust in his eyes, a trust that she had to honor. She couldn't let him down. Not now, not when everything was on the line. "You're going to be okay," she whispered to him, her voice soft. "I'm right here, okay? I won't leave you." He smiled weakly, his small hand squeezing hers. "I know, Mom, I'll be okay." The procedure was long, far longer than she had anticipated. It felt like an eternity as she sat by his side, watching the clock tick slowly, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on her. She had never felt so helpless in her life, not since the day she left everything behind. She had promised herself that she would do whatever it took to keep him safe, but this was something she couldn't control. She had to let go. She had to trust that the Tycoon's blood would work, that this procedure would give her son a chance at life. The Tycoon had gone with the doctors to oversee the process. She had watched him leave, his face grim but determined. When he had first arrived, there had been so much uncertainty between them. But now, after all the discussions, after all the planning, she could see that something had shifted. He wasn't just the man from her past anymore. He wasn't the man who had walked out of her life years ago. He was the one who had come back to save their son. And that meant something. As the hours stretched on, the weight of the situation settled in. The boy was still under, the procedure still ongoing. She kept herself busy, walking around the apartment, trying to distract herself from the reality of what was happening. But it was impossible to ignore. Every few minutes she would glance at her phone, hoping for an update, hoping for some sign that things were going well. But all she could do was wait. And worry. The Tycoon returned late in the afternoon, his face drained of color. He had been through the procedure himself, helping to provide the blood needed for the transfusion. But now, as he walked through the door, she could see the exhaustion in his posture, the weight of what he had just done hanging heavy on him. "Is he okay?" she asked, her voice trembling as she stood up. He looked at her, and for a moment his eyes seemed to soften. "He's stable," he said quietly. "The procedure went well. They'll be monitoring him closely for the next few hours, but we'll know soon enough if it's worked." She let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for doing this." He nodded, but he didn't say anything more. Instead, he turned and walked over to the boy's bedside. The boy was still unconscious, his face pale but calm, his breathing steady. The doctors had said the next few hours would be crucial. If the blood had taken, if the procedure had worked, he would begin to recover. But if it didn't, she pushed that thought from her mind. There was no point in thinking about the worst. All she could do now was wait and hope. The Tycoon stood at the bedside, watching her son with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. He didn't know how to feel about any of this. He hadn't expected to be in this position, hadn't expected to feel the weight of responsibility that had settled on his shoulders. But there was something about the boy, something about this moment that made him realize just how much he had to offer. It wasn't just about saving a life. It was about a chance to make things right, to somehow give the boy a future to make up for the years lost. He reached out and placed a hand gently on the boy's head, his touch soft and tentative. For a moment the room was quiet, save for the steady beep of the machines monitoring the boy's vitals. It felt like everything in the world had come down to this moment. This quiet, fragile moment. She watched him, her heart filled with gratitude. It wasn't just that he had agreed to help. It was that he was here, that he cared enough to stand beside her, to stand beside their son. She didn't know what the future would hold, but in this moment she felt a sense of peace. She wasn't alone anymore. Hours passed and she barely moved from her spot by her son's bedside. She watched as the doctors came and went, checking on his progress, making small adjustments to the machines. The Tycoon stayed with them, quietly offering his support, never leaving the room for long. It wasn't until the late evening that the doctor finally returned with an update. She stood up, her heart racing. The Tycoon looked up from the boy's side, his expression unreadable. "He's responding well," the doctor said, his voice filled with cautious optimism. "His vitals are stabilizing and the blood transfusion appears to be taking. We'll continue monitoring him closely, but for now we're hopeful." She felt a weight lift from her chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to breathe. Her son was going to make it. The procedure had worked. He was going to be okay. Tears filled her eyes and she couldn't hold them back. She had done it. She had fought for him, and so had the Tycoon. They had both given their all and it had worked. Her son would live, and for the first time in years she allowed herself to believe that things might just be okay. The Tycoon walked over to her, his eyes softening as he saw the tears in her eyes. "You did it," he said quietly, his voice filled with a kind of awe. "You saved him," she nodded, wiping her eyes. "We saved him. Together." And in that moment she realized that no matter what the future held, they had made it through this. They had done what needed to be done for their son. And that was all that mattered. The days following the procedure were a blur of relief and healing. Her son, who had been so fragile just a week ago, was starting to show signs of improvement. His color was returning, his energy slowly coming back. The Tycoon had kept his promise. The procedure had worked and their son was going to be okay. She spent most of her days by his side, watching him rest, knowing that each day brought him closer to full recovery. The doctors were pleased with his progress, and each visit to the hospital seemed to bring good news. There were still some complications to navigate, but the worst was over. The boy was alive, and that was what mattered most. The Tycoon visited them often, sometimes staying for hours, sometimes just a few minutes. He wasn't used to this, to being so involved in someone else's life. But there was a sense of responsibility now, something he hadn't expected to feel. He had no experience with children, but he couldn't deny the bond that was growing between him and the boy. There was something deeply human about the way they connected, even with everything that had come before. He was there for the boy, not just because of the blood they shared, but because he had come to care for him. The connection was there, undeniable, and it had changed something in him. It wasn't just about saving a life anymore. It was about being part of something bigger, about stepping into a role he never thought he'd play. There were still many questions, many unknowns, but for now he was willing to be there. He would take it one step at a time. She noticed the change in him. The man who had walked into their lives just days ago was not the same man who left the room that evening after the procedure. He was softer now, more present. There was a gentleness in his eyes when he looked at their son, a quiet affection that wasn't there before. It made her realize that perhaps they both had more to give than they had thought. Maybe the years they had spent apart could be overcome, not all at once, but piece by piece. She had always been careful not to hope too much. She had convinced herself that she could handle everything on her own, that she didn't need anyone else. But the events of the past week had shown her something different. She needed him, and maybe he needed her too. They both had a lot to figure out. But for the first time in years, she felt a sense of possibility, a sense that things might finally be coming together. One evening, after another long day at the hospital, she returned home with her son. He had insisted on walking out of the hospital on his own, though he was still a bit weak. She could see the spark in his eyes, the same spark that had been missing for so long. He was strong. He was going to be okay. And in that moment, she realized that she hadn't just saved him. She had saved herself too. She stood in the doorway of the apartment looking out at the city beyond. The world outside was busy, filled with life and noise, but it felt distant. Everything felt different now. The quiet peace of their home felt comforting in a way it hadn't before. They had been through so much, more than she had ever imagined. But they had made it through, and they had done it together. Her son walked over to the couch, sinking into the cushions with a contented sigh. She smiled and joined him, sitting beside him and wrapping her arm around his shoulders. They were quiet for a while, the only sound in the room being the soft hum of the city in the distance. "I can't believe how much has changed," she said quietly, her voice filled with wonder. "You're getting better." "I'm getting better. We're okay." Her son looked up at her, his face glowing with happiness. "I told you I'd be okay, didn't I?" His voice was still a little weak, but there was a strength in it now that hadn't been there before. "And you're right, Mom. We're going to be okay." Tears filled her eyes as she hugged him tighter. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "You've been so brave." He smiled, resting his head on her shoulder. "I had to be. You've been brave too. You're the reason I'm still here." She closed her eyes, a soft smile on her lips. "We did it together." Later that evening, the Tycoon came by to check on them. It was becoming a regular part of their lives now. His visits, the quiet moments shared between the three of them. He still wasn't sure what it all meant, but he didn't need to figure it out right away. What mattered was that they had made it through this ordeal, and they were stronger for it. He knocked softly before entering, a small smile on his face when he saw them both sitting on the couch. "How's he doing?" he asked, his voice gentle. She looked at him and nodded. "Better, much better. He's been asking about you." The Tycoon's face softened. "Good," he said, stepping closer. "I've been thinking about him. About both of you." Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what to say. She had always been afraid of what this moment would look like, the moment when they had to face the future, the moment when they would have to decide what came next. But right now all she could focus on was the present, on the fact that they were both here together. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. "I don't know how we could have done this without you." He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. "You didn't have to do it alone," he said softly. "You never have to do it alone again." Her heart skipped again, and for the first time in years she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for something more. Not just for her son, but for them. She had spent so long convincing herself that she was better off alone, that she didn't need anyone else. But she realized now that she was wrong. She needed him, and maybe he needed her too. "I've been thinking," he continued, his voice more hesitant now. "Maybe we could try to figure this out, all of us. I'm not saying I have all the answers. I'm not saying I know what's going to happen next, but I want to be here for you, for him." She didn't know what to say at first. She didn't know if she was ready for the complexity of it all, but she couldn't deny the feelings that were stirring inside her. The years apart, the pain, the confusion. It was all still there, but it felt different now. They had come through something together, and that meant something. "Maybe we can," she said softly, her voice steady but uncertain. "We'll take it one day at a time." "But yes, I think we can." The Tycoon nodded, his expression relieved. "One day at a time," he agreed. And in that moment, as they sat together, the three of them, a family in the truest sense, they knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still many unanswered questions, still many things to figure out. But for the first time in a long time, they had hope. They had each other. And that was enough. As the days passed, their bond grew stronger. They spent time together as a family, getting to know each other in ways they never had before. There were still challenges, still moments of uncertainty, but they faced them together. Slowly but surely, they began to rebuild what had been broken, and no matter where the future took them, they knew they would always have each other. The road ahead was unknown, but they were ready to face it together, because together they could overcome anything. The weeks that followed were filled with a sense of healing. Her son, now stronger each day, spent less time in bed and more time outside, soaking up the sun, breathing in fresh air. He had missed so much in those dark days, and now it seemed like every step he took brought him closer to the life he had once dreamed of. He had always been an energetic, curious boy, and as his body regained strength, so did his spirit. She watched him, her heart swelling with pride. For a long time, She had worried that he might never fully recover, that the scars of the past would remain. But now those fears seemed distant. The boy was laughing again, joking, even teasing her like he used to. And she could tell he was happy. He was starting to believe, just like she was, that everything would be okay. The Tycoon was still part of their lives, coming over regularly to check on their son, always offering help when needed, always looking for ways to contribute. It wasn't just about the medical procedure anymore. It was about the relationships that were starting to form, slowly but surely. She hadn't expected things to change so quickly. There was still a part of her that was afraid to trust, afraid to let him back into her world. After all, the years they had spent apart weren't easily forgotten. She had built a life without him, one that didn't depend on anyone. But now, as she saw the way he cared for their son, something in her shifted. She couldn't deny it anymore. He was here, and he was a part of their lives. One evening, after their son had gone to bed, she and the Tycoon sat on the couch, the silence between them comfortable but heavy with unspoken thoughts. They hadn't had many conversations about the future, about what it meant for them to move forward. It was as if they were both waiting for something, but neither knew what. The past was complicated and their present was uncertain, but something had changed. There was a bridge being built between them brick by brick, and neither of them was willing to tear it down. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice breaking the silence, "about us, about the future. I know we haven't talked much about it, but I want you to know that I'm here. I want to be part of your life, of his life." She turned to look at him, her gaze searching. It wasn't just the words he was saying. It was the sincerity behind them. She had always wondered what it would be like, if they ever had the chance to speak again, if they ever got the chance to rebuild. But now, sitting here, hearing him say it, she realized she wasn't sure what she wanted. The road to reconciliation wasn't clear, but something inside her told her that they could try. They could take it one step at a time, without rushing, without forcing anything, just being there for each other. "I don't know what the future holds," she said quietly. "I don't know if we're supposed to pick up where we left off or start something new, but I can't pretend that I don't see how much you care." For him, for me, his eyes softened. "I know we have a lot of work to do," he said, his voice gentle. "I'm not expecting anything from you. I just want you to know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Her heart swelled with something she hadn't felt in years, hope. It was a fragile thing, but it was there, slowly blooming. It wasn't about what had happened in the past anymore. It was about the choices they were making now, about what they could build moving forward. She didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. She just nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. They were on the same page. They didn't have to rush things. They could let it unfold, whatever it was. For the first time, the future felt a little less uncertain. As the days passed, they continued to find their rhythm. There were challenges, of course. Nothing was ever perfect. There were moments when she'd feel overwhelmed, moments when she'd catch herself wondering if this was really what she wanted. But then she'd watch her son playing with the Tycoon, laughing as they shared silly jokes, and she'd remember why they were doing this, why they were trying. Her son had grown attached to the Tycoon in a way that was both natural and surprising. At first, she had worried about how he would feel about the man who had been absent for so many years, the man who had no idea he even had a son. But now the two of them seemed to fit together effortlessly. The boy was eager to learn from him, to ask him questions about everything from business to life. And the Tycoon, despite his initial hesitations, seemed genuinely happy to be a part of it all. He would teach him small lessons, showing him how to fix things around the house or explaining things he thought were important. It was clear that he wanted to be a positive influence, not just for her sake, but for his son's sake too. And with each passing day, she saw more of the man she had once known, the man she had loved, the man she had walked away from. It wasn't the same relationship they had had before. It couldn't be. Too much had changed. But there was a kind of peace between them now, a quiet understanding that had been built over time. They never talked about their past much. It wasn't necessary. They both knew the mistakes that had been made, and they both knew that they couldn't change any of it. What mattered now was the present. What mattered now was their son and the life they were trying to build together. It wasn't easy. It wasn't always smooth, but they were trying, and that was enough. One evening, as they all sat down to dinner, the boy excitedly shared a story about his day at school. She watched them, her son animated and full of energy, the Tycoon sitting beside him listening intently, asking questions. It was a simple moment, but in that moment, she realized how far they had come. The dinner table had always been a place for family, a place where laughter and conversation filled the air, and now it was once again a place where they could all come together, even if they weren't a perfect family, even if things were still a little uncertain. It was enough. For now it was enough. As the evening came to a close, and her son had finished his meal and run off to his room to play, the Tycoon turned to her. "You know, I've been thinking," he began, his voice thoughtful, "about how lucky I am to be here, to have a second chance, not just with him, but with you." She looked at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "Second chances don't come easily," she said quietly. "But maybe they do come when we least expect them." He nodded. "Maybe, and I'm grateful. For this, for you, for him." She smiled softly, the warmth spreading through her chest. "We're lucky too," she replied, "to have each other." And in that moment she knew that their journey was far from over. It wouldn't be perfect, it wouldn't always be easy, but it would be theirs. Together they had overcome so much, and together they would face whatever came next.